Hello, friend. I managed to find some really amazing historical photos that you probably haven't seen yet. These are real shots from the past, and now I'm going to tell you about them. Far-right rioters hurl projectiles at French police near Place de la Concorde during the crisis of 6 February 1934. The unrest in Paris was so severe that the French government collapsed the very next day. Persabaya fans packed onto free military trucks after a win, with 24 vehicles carrying the crowd home in a wave of celebration. One overloaded truck tipped after barely 1 kilometer, turning the victory ride into sudden chaos. A long shared grave in Petrograd was prepared for victims of the 1917 revolution during the public funeral of March 23, 1917. The row of coffins turned a city ceremony into a stark sign that the old Russian Empire was collapsing. After a late-night wager in 1956, Thomas Fitzpatrick landed a light plane on a narrow Manhattan street right outside the bar he had just left. The story sounded so unreal that he came back 2 years later and did it again to prove it. In 1942, United States military jeeps were partly taken apart and packed into crates like this, so more vehicles could fit on ships heading overseas. In 1908, Julius Neubronner trained pigeons to carry tiny timed cameras and capture some of the earliest real bird's-eye photos from the sky. Germany later tested these camera pigeons in World War I, but the strange idea never became truly effective. American soldiers inspect the front of a 14th Armored Division M, 4A 376 Sherman near Bar in Alsace in late 1944. Several direct holes in the front armor show how even a powerful tank could be stopped on a narrow road. Italian troops hold a desert position in North Africa in 1942 with a Breda Model 30 and Carcano rifles. In terrain this open, even a low ridge of sand could decide who was seen first. Ottoman troops wear full white winter camouflage during World War I, blending into snow so well they almost vanish in the frame. The pale cloth covered nearly everything, turning ordinary soldiers into a quiet and unsettling shape on the frozen front. Men of the East Anglian Regiment sit in a captured German trench on the 20th of November, 1917, the first day of the Battle of Cambrai in France. Cambrai became one of the first major attacks where tanks broke through in large numbers. Russian soldiers pose in early gas masks with round glass eyes and long filter canisters hanging on their chests. The gear was made for protection, but it turned an ordinary group photo into one of the strangest images of World War I. The Motherland Calls towers over Volgograd with an 85-meter figure and sword, completed in 1967 as a memorial on Mamayev Kurgan. For years, it was the tallest statue in the world, which is why this skyline view looks almost unreal. 2 F-6F Hellcats sit wrecked on the deck of USS Saratoga after the 21st of February, 1945 attack. One hit turned a crowded carrier deck into a twisted field of smoke, broken wings, and blocked takeoffs. In September 1958, an AIM-9 Sidewinder, fired by a Taiwanese F-86, hit a Chinese MiG-17 and stayed stuck in the plane without exploding. Soviet engineers studied the intact missile in Moscow and turned its design into the K-13 in less than 2 years. Amelia Earhart demonstrates a flight training model to children in the 1930s, giving them a rare close look at how an airplane turns and balances. In that era, flying was still new to much of the public, so a lesson from Earhart was an extraordinary sight on its own. This huge rock-cut chamber is the tomb of Liu Sheng, a Han Dynasty prince who died in 113 BCE and was buried with rich objects from bronze figures to ritual vessels. The site became famous in 1968 when archaeologists found his jade burial suit inside. British soldiers ride a Mark IV tank after the opening day of Cambrai in France on November 20th, 1917. Cambrai shocked Europe because hundreds of tanks moved forward together. Unemployed men during the Great Depression hold signs demanding work after the 1929 crash shattered jobs across the country. By 1933, about 1 in 4 American workers had no job, which turned scenes like this into a national reality. In 1932, 84-year-old Betty Johnson gets a permanent wave in Madison, Wisconsin, from her granddaughter, Pearl Holman. The metal curlers hang from above because early permanent wave machines used heat and weight to shape the hair. During the 1991 Gulf War, soldiers of the 24th Infantry Division were evacuated after their own side mistakenly fired on their column near the airport. Under the Brooklyn Bridge in 1918, horse-drawn carts passed through a vacant lot, while the huge steel deck cuts the sky in half. The photo captures old street life moving beneath a bridge that had already become one of New York's engineering icons. In 1943, welders work on a bridge project in Des Moines, Iowa, wearing heavy masks and overalls as sparks flew around the steel. The image is striking because it shows black women doing skilled industrial work during World War II. An 1893 rail wreck near Lufkin shows 2 steam locomotives locked together while townspeople stand and sit across the damaged engines. The long dresses, hats, and packed crowd make the scene look almost unreal. This 1900 photo shows Native American children at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, one of the most famous boarding schools in the United States. Many were taken far from their families under an assimilation program meant to strip away their languages, names, and culture. German troops were the first to use military flame weapons in World War I, and some models could reach about 40 meters. The backpack device looked simple, but on the battlefield it became one of the strangest and most shocking machines of the era. In the 1930s, some beauty clinics used X-ray machines for hair removal because the treatment looked modern and effective. What seemed elegant and advanced later became a dark lesson in the hidden cost of early beauty technology. A guide rises from a hidden Viet Cong tunnel entrance during a Vietnam visit, showing how well these openings could vanish into the ground. For veterans, one sudden movement from a hole like this could bring the war back in an instant. The experimental A-820 car transporter was developed in the late 1950s in the Soviet Union to carry passenger cars on a multi-level trailer. Created by research engineers with factory specialists, it looked decades ahead of ordinary road transport. The United States Board of Tea experts tastes tea in 1947, judging imports by flavor, smell, and quality. The table looks almost ceremonial, but these tests help decide which tea could enter the American market. In 1989, Cheeto Shedden rescued an injured crocodile named Poncho, and the two stayed closely bonded for about 20 years. Their friendship became so unusual that Cheeto was later photographed resting beside the animal as if it were completely normal. In May 1985, Philadelphia police dropped an explosive from a helicopter onto the Move House in West Philadelphia, and the fire destroyed an entire city block. It remains the only known case of a United States city using an air-dropped explosive against its own residents. In 1962, women pose with parts from 4 early Army computers in front of a wall of wiring and switches. The boards in their hands show how huge machines once depended on hardware that now looks almost handmade. The Iranian delegation sits at the 1973 OPEC summit in Kuwait, where Iran declared the full nationalization of its oil industry. The decision marked a major shift in power, putting one of the world's richest oil sectors firmly under national control. Robert DeFeo Jr. is led through a police station in 1974 after the Amityville case that made the house famous across the United States. The image shows the real man behind a story that later turned into one of America's most talked about true crime legends. At the 1937 America's Cup, Endeavor II crossed too early, losing precious position before the race had even properly begun. In a contest decided by tiny timing margins, one fast move became an instant and very costly mistake. A German tracked cargo truck stands beside a giant multi-engine aircraft in 1943, and the size difference makes the machine look almost unreal. King Ferdinand of Romania decorates officers after the 1919 Hungarian-Romanian War. The ceremony came in the same campaign that saw Romanian forces enter Budapest after the collapse of the Hungarian Soviet Republic. Princess Diana meets Salman during her 1986 visit to Saudi Arabia. Salman was governor of Riyadh at the time and became King of Saudi Arabia in 2015. Franklin D. Roosevelt celebrates his 61st birthday aboard a Boeing flying boat in 1943. He turned 61 on January 30th, 1943, while serving his third term as President of the United States. Huge crowds packed the streets for Macy's first Thanksgiving parade in 1924. The parade was launched by the department store as a holiday promotion and later became one of the most famous annual events in the United States. Monkeys sit in miniature race cars while women watch the track in 1927. The photo captures a novelty entertainment act from the era, when trained animals were often used in staged public spectacles. Pope John Paul II rides in the Popemobile during his 1984 visit to Newfoundland. The raised glass cabin was designed to keep him visible to crowds while adding extra protection during public appearances. In 1992, Jurassic Park was still being developed with stop-motion dinosaur animation, and artists built physical models like this for test shots. That plan changed after Industrial Light and Magic showed Steven Spielberg digital dinosaur footage that pushed the film toward computer-generated effects. Residents carry a refrigerator through floodwater after the Sydney flood of 1961. Streets turned into channels, and families had to move furniture by hand to save what they could from the rising water. In Brooklyn in 1923, two BMT train cars derailed and fell about 35 feet onto Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues. The accident killed 8 people and injured many more, becoming one of the most serious early subway disasters in New York City. A woman machines an aircraft frame in 1942 during a World War II production. During the war, women filled millions of industrial jobs and became a major part of aircraft factory work. Southdale Center in Minnesota opened in 1956 as the first fully enclosed climate-controlled shopping mall in the United States. It was designed by Victor Gruen, and its layout became the model for indoor malls across America. Buffalo Soldiers of the United States Army pose in the late 1800s. The name was used for black regiments formed after the Civil War, including the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Czech and Slovak soldiers advance across open ground during the Battle of Zborov in 1917. The battle became the first major success of the Czechoslovak Legion and later helped strengthen support for an independent Czechoslovak state. Dr. Ribeiro, a Goan physician, rides a zebra on the streets of Nairobi in the 1900s. Zebras were sometimes trained for riding, but they were never widely domesticated like horses. After the Munich Agreement in 1938, Czech refugees load their belongings before leaving for Prague. The deal forced Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland, and many families were pushed out of the border regions. 2 United States Marines of the 4th Marine Division stand atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima in 1945. The volcano rose about 169 meters above the island and gave a clear view over the landing beaches below. South Vietnamese civilians climbed the wall of the United States Embassy in Saigon in 1975. The scene unfolded during the final evacuation in April 1975, days before Saigon fell and the Vietnam War ended. In 1945, this wall carried a slogan telling men aged 16 to 70 that they belonged at the front, not in the bunker. It reflected Germany's final war months, when authorities were pushing boys, older men, and civilians into last-ditch defense. Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna pose in 17th-century-style court dress for the 1903 costume ball at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The event became one of the last grand Romanov court celebrations before the Russian Empire fell in 1917. A Japanese toy maker shapes a wooden toy by hand while a child watches in 1920. The floor is covered with wood shavings, showing that many toys of the period were still made in small workshops with simple hand tools. Alain Delon practices his signature in a still from Purple Noon in 1960. The film was René Clément's adaptation of The Talented Mr. Ripley and became one of the key early roles of Delon's career. Soviet soldiers celebrate outside the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945 after the city fell. The Reichstag became one of the main symbols of the Battle of Berlin, which ended just days before Germany's surrender in Europe. A crashed aircraft lies across a Brooklyn street in 1960 as crowds gather around the wreckage. The disaster became one of the deadliest air crashes in New York City history and also struck people on the ground. Frank Zappa sits on a tractor in 1968. By then, he had already released Freak Out and We Are Only in It for the Money with the Mothers of Invention. Young dancers rehearsed backstage at the Paris Opera House in 1937. The Paris Opera Ballet was one of the oldest ballet institutions in Europe and remained a major center of classical dance training at the time. Marseille's Transporter Bridge opened in 1905 and carried people and vehicles across the Old Port on a suspended moving platform. Designed by Ferdinand Arnaudin, it kept the roadway high above the harbor so ships could pass underneath. An abandoned military aircraft lies broken in a Bosnian field in 1997, with most of its outer structure already stripped away. The Bosnian War had ended in 1995, and wrecks like this remained in parts of the country as visible post-war debris. Ronald Reagan stands in the Oval Office with two people dressed as a horse in 1989. He left the presidency in January 1989 after serving 2 full terms. Nurses attend a lecture at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh in 1957. By the 1950s, nurse training in Britain included formal classroom study alongside hospital ward work. This police notice in Brazil bans the use of German, Italian, and Japanese and states that only Portuguese may be spoken. Such restrictions were enforced during the Vargas era and intensified after Brazil entered World War II against the Axis in 1942. South African police play soccer in Nyanga Township in 1976. Nyanga was a black township under apartheid, and the photo was taken during a year of major unrest across South Africa. J. Robert Oppenheimer lectures at Kyoto University in 1960, standing before a blackboard filled with equations. By then, he was director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and one of the most famous physicists in the world. Deng Xiaoping wears a cowboy hat during a rodeo visit in Simonton, Texas, in 1979. The visit took place just weeks after the United States and the People's Republic of China established full diplomatic relations. Students stand over the rubble of Pantglas Junior School after the Aberfan disaster in Wales in 1966. A coal waste slide buried the school and nearby homes, killing 144 people, including 116 children. Women line up for the start of a relay swimming race in Stockholm in 1912 as officials and spectators watch from the poolside. The 1912 Stockholm Games were the first Olympics to include women's swimming events. 70-year-old Mr. Engelhardt stands in the water in a heavy diving suit in the Oostzaanergat in 1919. Early diving gear used a metal helmet and an air hose from the surface, long before modern diving tanks. Rows of surplus warships sit laid up after World War II between 1945 and 1948. After the war, many naval vessels were decommissioned and sold for scrap because wartime fleets were far larger than peacetime needs. Marcella Miller stands with the Miss Coney Island 1925 sash during a beauty contest at Brooklyn's famous seaside resort. In the 1920s, Coney Island drew huge crowds with pageants, amusement parks, and summer shows. Elvis and Priscilla Presley appear with their newborn daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, in 1968. Lisa Marie was born on February 1, 1968, less than 1 year after Elvis and Priscilla married in Las Vegas. In 1963, James Meredith became the first black student to graduate from the University of Mississippi. He earned a degree in political science on August 18, 1963. Less than 1 year after his enrollment, triggered a federal intervention on campus. In 1914, this flying boat linked Tampa and St. Petersburg in about 23 minutes across Tampa Bay, cutting a much longer water trip to a shockingly short ride. It became part of the world's first scheduled airline service, and huge crowds came just to watch it glide over the bay. In 1867, a miner in Nevada's Gould and Curry Tunnel worked inside a tight timbered cut on the Comstock Lode, one of the richest silver finds in United States history. The ore from this lode turned Virginia City into a boomtown. In 1914, Dr. Charles Campbell pushed towns in Texas to build bat roosts like this one so thousands of bats would move in and eat mosquitoes at night. After the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, these clocks were pulled from Olive View Hospital, one of the hardest-hit medical sites in the Los Angeles area. The disaster helped drive much stricter earthquake safety rules for California hospitals in the years that followed. In 1926, President Coolidge stood at the White House while Boy Scouts packed around him and raised hundreds of hats into the air. By the 1920s, the Boy Scouts of America had become a huge national movement that could draw crowds like this. With Half Dome behind him, Ansel Adams set up a large format camera in Yosemite in 1935, using equipment heavy enough to ride on top of the car. His Yosemite photographs later became some of the most famous landscape images in the United States. In 1902, child workers in Philadelphia held signs demanding school, justice, and relief from long factory hours. Photos like this helped expose how common child labor still was in the United States at the start of the 1900s. In 1962, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie stood at Jubilee Palace with 2 pet cheetahs, creating one of the most unusual royal photos of the 1900s. Selassie had first become emperor in 1930 and remained a global symbol of Ethiopia for decades. This behind-the-scenes photo shows the Hound of the Baskervilles being filmed on Stage 15 at 20th Century Fox Studios in Los Angeles in 1939. The movie opened on March 31, 1939, and became the first of 14 Sherlock Holmes films starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. In 1949, wrecked landing craft still lay on the beaches of Normandy, showing that the damage from the June 1944 landings had not fully disappeared even after 5 years. In 1942, Greer Garson planted the first registered miniver rose at the Volunteer Army Canteen Service in Los Angeles. California botanist Eugene S. Borner bred the rose to honor the heroine of Mrs. Miniver. This 1950s ad shows the hot dog sizzler, a gadget that plugged into a car's electrical system and cooked 2 hot dogs in 3 to 5 minutes. It was marketed during the boom of post-war car gadgets, when American drivers were being sold everything from dash trays to in-car cookers. On November 22, 1963, John and Jacqueline Kennedy arrived at Love Field in Dallas and entered the open Lincoln for the downtown motorcade. Jackie's pink suit from that morning became one of the most recognized outfits in American history. In April 1996, a boy played on a wrecked tank in Sarajevo just after the city's siege ended. The siege lasted from 1992 to 1996 and became the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. In 1927, Benito Mussolini was photographed playing the violin in a formal studio scene. By then, he had already led Italy for 5 years. In October 1914, the Sarajevo trial showed the young men accused of killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand only months after the June attack. That attack helped trigger the chain of events that opened World War I. In 1937, Eva Braun posed while imitating American singer Al Jolson, one of the biggest entertainment stars of the early 1900s. Jolson's stage image was so widely known that it was still being copied in Europe decades after his rise. In 1942, the French fleet at Toulon was scuttled to keep 77 ships out of German control. It became one of the largest fleet scuttlings in naval history. In 1940, Thompson and Reed tested this experimental speedboat in Michigan with a giant drum-shaped body instead of a normal hull. The design shows how inventors were still trying radically different ways to build faster boats before modern racing hulls became standard. In 1944, American troops packed this landing ship before going ashore in New Guinea during the Pacific War. The New Guinea campaign helped isolate major Japanese bases and cleared a path toward the Philippines. In 1944, this damaged Douglas A-20G Havoc was photographed over New Guinea during the Pacific Campaign. The A-20G was a fast, low-level aircraft armed with 6 forward-firing machine guns. These floating nets were stretched across harbor entrances to block German submarines from slipping into protected waters. Anti-submarine barriers like this became a major coastal defense in World War I and World War II. In 1941 and 1942, German tank crews built a model of the Soviet KV-1 to learn its shape for fast recognition in combat. Early in the Eastern Front, the KV-1 gained a fearsome reputation because its heavy armor could resist many German guns then in service. In 1963, Japan created this sleep aid with a built-in heartbeat to calm babies who could not fall asleep without their mothers. Its shape copied a mother's chest, making it one of the strangest child care inventions of its time. 4 German airmen captured after an air raid on Kiev, June 25, 1941. The photo was taken just 3 days after Operation Barbarossa began, when the Eastern Front was only starting. In 1941, courier Meg Muat, known as Miss Mercury, took a dispatch for delivery on her motorcycle. Women dispatch riders carried urgent wartime messages through city streets when speed mattered most. An 1890 photograph shows Raffaele Esposito preparing pizza in Naples, making it one of the earliest known pizza images. Esposito is commonly linked to pizza margherita, the style later associated with Queen Margherita of Italy. In 1949, Agatha Christie photographed a buried winged bull at Nimrud in Iraq, a major Assyrian city founded nearly 3,000 years earlier. Much of the site was ruined in 2015, making this image a rare record of what still survived then. In 1956, Robbie the Robot appeared at the Sands Blackjack table in Las Vegas as a publicity stunt. The same year, Robbie became a science fiction icon through Forbidden Planet, one of the most influential films of the decade. Behind the scenes of Jaws in 1975, crew members lift the full-size mechanical shark built for the film. The prop was nicknamed Bruce, and its repeated failures helped make the shark appear less on screen. During a break on The Sound of Music in 1965, Julie Andrews sat with her daughter Emma and read Variety. The film won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and became one of the biggest movie hits of the decade. In 1939, a Japanese officer sits with a broken katana after the fighting at Nanchang in China. Nanchang became one of the biggest campaigns of that year in the long conflict between China and Japan. The Crypt of Civilization was sealed at Oglethorpe University on May 28, 1940, with records and everyday objects from its time. It is set to be opened on May 28, 8113, after 6,173 years. A rare 1913 color photo shows a family outside a thatched cottage in Galway, Ireland. It records the rough walls, grass roof, and worn clothes that marked poor rural life there before the First World War. In 1914, this women's football team posed at a London ammunition factory in matching AEC uniforms. Factory teams like this helped push women's football into public view before it drew huge crowds during the First World War. A rare 1917 color photo shows Senegalese soldiers serving in the French army resting between battles during the First World War. France recruited tens of thousands of West African troops. Martin Luther King Jr. was photographed by Birmingham police in 1963 after his arrest during protests against segregation. While held there, he wrote "Letter from Birmingham Jail," one of the most important texts of the civil rights movement. Lot Long, a Wiltshire thatcher, was photographed in Shaftesbury at Whitsuntide in 1892, carrying a huge bundle of sticks on his back. The image became world famous after Led Zeppelin used it for the cover art of Led Zeppelin IV. In April 1942, Japanese-American families waited at the Santa Anita Reception Center in Los Angeles after wartime removal orders forced them from their homes. Santa Anita, a racetrack turned temporary camp, held thousands before they were sent to larger inland camps. On August 25, 1953, Sophia Loren was photographed at her home in Rome in some of her first modeling shots. Within a few years, she became one of Italy's biggest film stars. In 1973, the West Side Highway in Lower Manhattan had decayed so badly that whole sections were already crumbling. Later that year, an overloaded dump truck broke through the elevated roadway and forced its permanent closure. David Ferry's 1961 mugshot later became linked to the Kennedy case after New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison named him as a suspect. Ferry died in 1967, and 2 notes were found at his home that same day. In June 1936, 4 Griffin children were photographed near Greensboro, Alabama, at a federal land use project. Under segregation rules, their family was classified as mixed race, and they were pushed out by both white and black communities. Around 1863, Rebecca Huger, a formerly enslaved girl from New Orleans, was photographed in a studio portrait after gaining freedom. The image is a rare Civil War-era record of a child whose life was shaped by slavery and emancipation. A 1920 photo shows a monocycle, a one-wheel vehicle with the driver seated inside the giant wheel. It looked futuristic, but machines like this stayed experimental because they were hard to balance and control. Walter H. Stewart, also known as Sir Walter Stewart, was a 19th-century American sideshow performer born without hands or feet. He was known as a skilled wood carver and survived a fire in 1879. In 1972, Gnassingbé Eyadema appears here at about 36 or 37, only 5 years after taking power in Togo. He ruled until 2005, making him one of Africa's longest-serving leaders. In 1947, Lord Mountbatten met Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah as Britain prepared to divide British India. Partition created India and Pakistan and triggered one of the largest migrations in modern history. On March 30, 1941, people in Nanjing marked the first anniversary of the Japanese-backed government, led by Wang Jingwei. The giant banner calls Wang the top leader of China's revival, showing how the regime used public displays to claim legitimacy. A late 1890s snapshot shows young women laughing and piling together in a living room or dorm-style interior. Most photos from that decade were formal studio poses, so a candid scene like this is unusually rare and modern. These portraits show Arctic explorer Charles Francis Hall, who led 3 expeditions north before dying in 1871 after falling suddenly ill aboard the Polaris. When his body was examined 97 years later, high arsenic levels were found. In 1937, former King Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson met Adolf Hitler during their visit to Germany. The meeting came just 1 year after Edward gave up the British throne. This 1895 police photo shows Vladimir Lenin after his arrest by Tsarist authorities in St. Petersburg. He was only 25, and the exile that followed came 22 years before he took power in Russia. In 1935, an Ethiopian soldier is fitted with a gas mask captured from Italian forces during the fighting in Ethiopia. The photo was taken after the Christmas counteroffensive and the victory at Dembaguina Pass in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. In June 1908, Dowager Empress Marie Feodorovna bends to touch the cheek of Tsarevich Alexei aboard the imperial yacht Standard, during King Edward VII's visit to Reval. The girl beside him is Grand Duchess Marie. Around 1941 or 1942, Jane Russell was photographed in a dressing room at the very start of her career. Within a few years, she became one of Hollywood's most recognizable stars. In 1935, Shirley Temple rides the miniature race car Bill Robinson gave her during The Little Colonel. She drove it around the Fox lot with Robinson riding behind her and kept it as one of her favorite possessions for life. On August 10, 1942, whaleboats from the destroyer Stack rescued the crew of a PBY-5 Catalina after the aircraft went down at sea. The Catalina became one of the most important Allied patrol planes of the Pacific, used for scouting and air-sea rescue. On March 30, 1943, TBF-1, Avengers from USS Essex, dropped an early Mark 13 practice torpedo over the Gulf of Paria near Trinidad. Early Mark 13 torpedoes often bounced and ran badly after release, so the weapon needed major fixes later in the war. In 1945, a United States Marine captain interviews Japanese soldiers returning home in Sasebo after the war. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, Sasebo became a key occupation port under Allied control. In the early 1980s, South Korea built concrete defensive positions that looked more like stone fortresses than modern bunkers. They were part of Cold War border defenses, with thick walls and narrow firing openings cut into the structure. In the 1950s, Turkish troops in South Korea cared for Korean war orphans and helped educate them. This photo shows children linked to a Turkish-run school or orphan home, a little-known part of the war's aftermath. In 1957, Ho Chi Minh was photographed working in the fields beside Vietnamese farmers. Images like this reinforced his public image as a leader tied to peasants who made up most of the country's population. In 1940 or 1941, a German sentry stood on the roof of Wawel Royal Castle above Krakow during the occupation of Poland. Wawel became a key seat of German rule, turning one of Poland's most important royal landmarks into an administrative stronghold. In 1954, Chinese prisoners released after the Korean War March after choosing Taiwan instead of returning to mainland China. Thousands made that choice, turning prisoner release into one of the war's biggest political battles. In 1913, American Civil War veterans met at Gettysburg National Military Park for the 50th anniversary of the battle. The reunion brought Union and Confederate veterans back to the same ground where they had faced each other in 1863. In 1914, Harry Houdini posed beside former United States President Theodore Roosevelt aboard the SS Imperator. Roosevelt had left the White House in 1909, while Houdini was then one of the most famous performers in the world. This 1859 portrait shows Otto von Bismarck while he was Prussia's ambassador to Russia. Within 12 years, he had unified Germany in 1871 after wars against Denmark, Austria, and France. In May 1945, 5 crewmen escaped from the German U-534 after it sank to the seabed at a depth of 67 meters. They swam out through the torpedo hatch, making it a rare deep-water submarine escape. Lieutenant General William H. Simpson awards the Legion of Merit to Soviet Commander Alexander V. Gorbatov during the Allied link-up in 1945. The Legion of Merit was one of the highest United States decorations given to foreign commanders. This early 1900s photo shows workers packing Rowntree chocolate in York, one of Britain's biggest sweet factories. Rowntree later launched famous brands like Kit Kat and Smarties. This image retells the 1725 case of Peter Plagojewicz from Serbia, one of the earliest famous vampire stories recorded in Europe. Reports about him spread far beyond his village and helped turn local folklore into a wider European obsession. Ark 2 is a survival shelter started in the 1980s and designed to hold about 500 people. It was built with its own generators, a decontamination room, a radio station, and a chapel, and its owner said people could enter free. In 1940s, Üsküdar, a street bread seller, was photographed on Batpazarı Street beside a donkey loaded with goods. The street name came from the old Ottoman term for second-hand markets, which shifted from Bayatpazarı to Batpazarı and later Bitpazarı. In 1950 South Korea, Turkish soldiers stand in line for food while a small Korean girl named Ayla waits at the front. The photo captures one of the most human scenes of the Korean War, where soldiers and orphaned children crossed paths far from home. This was the Nuremberg rally site, where huge Nazi Party gatherings were staged in the 1930s. The same ground is now an ordinary fenced field and sports area, stripping the old propaganda setting down to plain open space. This 1970s Turkish sign warned people not to walk around the picnic area in pajamas. The text reads, "Please do not walk around in pajamas," showing that even casual public spaces could have strict dress rules. The French battleship Bouvet is seen at launch in Lorient before the First World War. On March 18, 1915, it struck a mine in the Dardanelles and sank within minutes with about 600 crew aboard. In 1934, Turkish women held a rally to thank Mustafa Kemal Ataturk after reforms expanded their place in public and political life. That same year, women in Turkey won full national voting rights and the right to enter parliament. In 1986, Cleveland's Balloon Fest released about 1.5 million balloons in a giant charity stunt. The launch looked stunning, but the falling balloons soon disrupted roads, flights, and a Coast Guard search. This image repeats a World War II claim that prisoners held in Canada were treated so well that some did not want to leave after release. Canada ran large prisoner camps during the war, and stories like this helped give those camps an unusual reputation. Li Qingyuan was a real Chinese herbalist, but his famous age of 256 came from disputed old reports, while Time in 1933 said Li himself claimed 197. Modern researchers treat the story as a longevity myth, not a verified record. Mildred and Richard Loving are at home in 1965, 2 years before their case ended Virginia's 1924 ban on interracial marriage. The 1967 ruling struck down similar laws across 16 states and changed marriage rights across the United States. Harvey Keitel sits with Catherine and Martin Scorsese during a break on Taxi Driver in 1976. That same year, the film won the top prize at Cannes and later received 4 Academy Award nominations. Screen star Frances Farmer was taken into custody in 1943 when her court battles had already become national headlines. The image stunned the public because a rising Hollywood actress was suddenly seen on a police station floor instead of a film set. In 1943, Fawzia was the sister of King Farouk of Egypt and the Queen of Iran through her marriage to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Her 1939 marriage linked the Egyptian and Iranian royal families, but it ended in 1948. Elton John helped carry Ryan White's coffin in 1990 after becoming one of the teenager's closest public supporters. White was only 18, and his story changed how millions of Americans saw fear, school bans, and compassion. At 18, Diana Spencer worked as a nanny in London before the world knew her as Princess Diana. Just 2 years later, her engagement to Prince Charles turned scenes like this into the last glimpses of her ordinary life. In 1974, John Lennon was removed from the Troubadour in Los Angeles after a wild night that quickly became local legend. He later sent waitress Pam an apology note signed by Lennon, adding that Harry Nilsson felt the same way. In 1962, a mother leads 3 children through a rubble-filled back alley in Liverpool, where many families were still living in old inner-city housing. The broken walls, soot-dark brick, and narrow passage turn one ordinary walk into a hard record of post-war city life. In 1934, a dense crowd gathered outside the Czechoslovak embassy in Berlin after reports that ethnic Germans had been mistreated at Charles University in Prague. In 1987, Billy Joel let fans carry him above the crowd during his show in Moscow, Soviet Union. The concert was part of one of the first major American rock tours there, turning a pop show into a Cold War moment. In 1927, 16-year-old Ronald Reagan worked as a lifeguard in Dixon, Illinois, long before Hollywood and the White House. He kept that summer job for 6 years and was said to have pulled 77 people from the Rock River. In 1942, a B-25 lifted off USS Hornet in one of the most unlikely takeoffs of World War II. The Doolittle mission stunned Japan and gave the United States its first direct air operation over the Japanese mainland. When Haile Selassie landed in Jamaica in 1966, thousands rushed the runway and turned his arrival into one of the island's most famous public scenes. For many Rastafarians, this was not just a state visit, but the day the man they saw as a sacred king finally stepped onto Jamaican soil. In 1946, a train of expelled Germans from Czechoslovakia reached Bavaria in the American Zone, part of one of Europe's largest post-war population transfers. After the war, about 3 million ethnic Germans were removed from Czechoslovakia. In 1937, Carlist soldiers used a pause at the front to grapple with a cow in the countryside during the Spanish Civil War. The frame is striking because uniforms, a mounted officer, and farm animals all appear in one moment. In 1944, Finnish and Soviet soldiers stand together just after the ceasefire that ended the continuation war. The image is striking because men from opposite sides share one calm moment after 3 years of conflict. In 1957, performers from the Polak Bros Circus turned one bicycle into a full acrobatic platform. The riders hold matching one-arm poses on a single moving bike, a stunt built on balance, timing, and trust. In 1930s, Ohrid, this stark white monument, marked schoolchildren who had been executed, standing alone above open ground near the lake. Its plain tower and empty setting make the memorial more unsettling. In 1942, German female communications auxiliaries paused at the Parthenon in Athens, a temple first built in 447 before Christ. The contrast is striking. Modern uniforms stand beside a ruin more than 2,300 years old while Greece was under occupation. Fathlo Harjo was said to be born in 1791 and lived until 1904, reaching 113 years of age. He fought in 2 Seminole wars, making this portrait feel like one man standing between the late 1700s and the modern 1900s. In 1944, Charles de Gaulle stood in silence at George Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon while leading Free France. The moment linked France's most visible wartime leader with the first president of the United States, as Europe was still fighting for freedom. In 1924, Bertrand Milburn Clark became the first black man to play at Wimbledon, decades before Arthur Ashe. One of the only known photos of him nearly vanished until a family descendant found his records and brought his name back into view. In 1900, a clam seller stood beside his pushcart in Mulberry Bend, one of the most crowded streets in Old New York. The photo captures a vanished city world where street food, pharmacy windows, and tenement life met on one tight corner. John Schrank is shown under arrest in Milwaukee in 1912 after the attack on Theodore Roosevelt during the presidential campaign. Roosevelt was wounded but still delivered a speech that lasted about 84 minutes before going to the hospital. In 1958, John Wayne visited United States troops in the Philippines during the Cold War. The Philippines still hosted major American bases then, so this photo links one of Hollywood's biggest stars to the United States military presence in Asia. In 1946, Eva Schloss sat for this photo 1 year after returning from Auschwitz at age 16. Later, her mother married Otto Frank, making Eva the posthumous stepsister of Anne Frank. This 1930 booking photo shows Charles Bannon in North Dakota after authorities tied him to the disappearance of the 6-member Schaefer family. He had worked as the family's farmhand, which made the case one of the most shocking in the state's history. In 1938, Polish state authorities tore down a Ukrainian Orthodox church in eastern Poland during the Revindication campaign. Across the Chelm region, church towers disappeared within months as the state moved to remove visible Orthodox presence. In the 2000s, Bradshaw and The Undertaker sat on a throne inside one of Saddam Hussein's former palaces after the Iraq invasion. The image feels unreal because two wrestling stars appear in a fallen ruler's lavish hall, where power, spectacle, and war briefly collided. In 1938, Hungarians in southern Czechoslovakia greeted entering Hungarian soldiers with flowers after the First Vienna Award shifted the border. One political decision changed the map overnight, and this quiet road suddenly became a stage for history. In 1940, Polish children played in the ruins of a house in occupied Warsaw, where broken walls and open stairways had already become part of the street. The photo is striking because the children moved through wreckage like a playground. By March 1945, air raids had left whole streets of Berlin in ruins, while water and electricity failed across many districts. Civilians were surviving on paper-thin bread rations as Soviet forces stood only about 60 to 70 kilometers away. In 1966, a pre-dawn blast tore open the lower floors of the Victoria Hotel in Saigon, a building used by United States officers. One vehicle turned a city block into wreckage within seconds, making this one of the most shocking attacks in wartime Saigon. In order not to miss new collections of historical photos, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to write in the comments which photo impressed you the most. Thanks for watching.